The moment Eliza Calloway stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Creek, Colorado, in the spring of 1878, the dust rose up around her boots like the town itself was trying to warn her away, and she told herself that was just fine, because she had not come here to be welcomed. She had come here to disappear. The town of Redemption Creek sat at the base of the San Juan Mountains, a rough scatter of timber buildings and sun-bleached storefronts pressed between red canyon walls and a creek that ran cold and fast with snowmelt. It was nothing like Boston. Nothing like the brownstone she had grown up in, or the parlors with their velvet curtains and silver candlesticks, or the dining rooms where men in pressed coats talked about futures that had already been decided without consulting the women sitting beside them. It was raw and loud and smelled of horses and sawdust, and something baking in the oven of the bakery 2 doors down, and Eliza breathed it all in and felt, for the first time in 8 months, like she could breathe at all. She was 24 years old and she carried 1 trunk, 1 carpet bag, and a letter of employment from a man named Gerald Holt, who ran the town's only general store and had advertised in an Eastern newspaper for a bookkeeper with experience in ledgers and accounts. She had experience in ledgers and accounts. She had experience in a great many things that had not saved her from the particular ruin that had driven her west, but she was choosing not to think about that anymore. That was the agreement she had made with herself on the 3-week journey from Boston. She would not think about Edmund. She would not think about the wedding that had been set for March, or the way he had looked at her across the parlor with his carefully arranged expression of regret when he told her he had chosen another woman, a woman with a larger inheritance and a father with political connections, and that he hoped she understood. She would not think about how she had stood there in her mother's parlor with the afternoon light coming through the lace curtains and felt the floor give way beneath her, not literally, but in every way that mattered. She would not think about her mother's tight-lipped disappointment or her father's quiet, helpless shrug, or the months after in which every social engagement felt like a theater production where everyone had memorized their lines about her humiliation, and she had not been given a script. She was not going to think about any of that. She was going to be the bookkeeper for Gerald Holt's general store in Redemption Creek, Colorado, and she was going to build walls so thick and so tall around herself that nothing and nobody would ever get close enough to reach her heart again. Gerald Holt turned out to be a round, red-faced man with a good-natured squint and a wife named Dot, who immediately tried to feed Eliza 3 different kinds of pie upon her arrival. They had a room above the store available for rent, small and sparse but clean, with a window that looked out over the main street and a rag rug on the plank floor, and a bed with a quilt stitched in a pattern of flying geese. Eliza paid the first month's rent from her savings, set her trunk at the foot of the bed, and considered herself home. She started work the next morning and was immediately appalled by the state of the ledgers. Gerald Holt was a good man and a fair merchant, but he had been keeping his own accounts for 15 years with a system that appeared to be based primarily on intuition and hope. Numbers were crossed out and re-entered in different columns. Credits had been recorded as debits on at least 6 occasions. There were entire months in 1876 where it appeared no record had been kept at all, and a section in the back of the oldest ledger where someone, presumably Gerald, had written the word miscellaneous in large letters, and then listed beneath it a collection of items that included fence posts, a lady's hat, 13 pounds of coffee, and 1 mule. That mule was a gift, Gerald told her when she asked, not looking remotely embarrassed. Eliza said, "A gift to whom or from whom?" Gerald said, "Well, that's the question, isn't it?" She closed the ledger and began from the beginning, which was exactly how she preferred it. Work was clean. Work was logical. Work had rules that did not change based on the feelings of the people involved. And she found in those first weeks in Redemption Creek that throwing herself entirely into the reconstruction of Gerald Holt's financial records was the most effective method yet devised for not thinking about Edmund Fairchild or her broken heart, or the life she had left behind. She met most of the town gradually, in the way that people pass through a general store. She met the pastor and his wife, and the school teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Pratt who had come west for much the same reasons Eliza had, and who was the first person in Redemption Creek to make Eliza laugh, which happened over a conversation about the appalling lack of decent tea. She met the sheriff, a lean, weathered man named Dale Briggs who wore his badge with the mild expression of someone who found his job either very dull or very terrifying, and was not going to tell you which. She met the families who came in on Saturdays from the surrounding ranches and farms, sunburned men and capable women and children who ran between the barrels of flour and the bolts of cloth, while their parents conducted the serious business of weekly provisions. And then one afternoon in her third week, when the light was slanting gold and sharp through the store windows and she was deep in a column of figures, the bell above the door rang and she heard a voice say to Gerald, "I need to settle my account, Holt, and I need 200 feet of fence wire if you have it." The voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that did not raise itself to be heard and yet managed to fill whatever room it occupied. She did not look up. She heard Gerald say, "I have it, Cade just came in last week, and your account is in better hands than mine now, I'll tell you that. Miss Calloway, this is Cade Harlow, got the spread up on the East Ridge. Cade, this here is Eliza Calloway, my new bookkeeper." Eliza looked up then, because there was no way not to without being rude, and she met the eyes of a man who was watching her with an expression of such direct and uncomplicated attention that it startled her. He was tall, with the kind of build that came from real work rather than the fashionable ambitions of city men who lifted weights for sport. He wore a canvas work coat the color of faded sage, trousers tucked into worn boots, and a hat that had clearly been through weather. His face was angular and sun-darkened, with lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting into distance rather than from age, because he could not have been more than 28 or 29. He had dark hair under the hat and a jaw that had been shaved recently, but not today. But it was his eyes that held her attention briefly before she looked away. They were the particular clear gray of the sky just before a storm, and they looked at her with the alert stillness of someone who saw things that other people missed. "Miss Calloway," he said. "Mr. Harlow," she said, and looked back at her ledger. She heard Gerald chuckle somewhere behind a shelf of hardware, and she chose to ignore that as well. Cade Harlow settled his account, which she found in the ledger under his name and which was accurate and always paid on time. She noted, unlike 3 other accounts she had already flagged for Gerald's attention. He bought his fence wire and a few other items and he left, and Eliza returned to her figures, and that was that. Except that it was not quite that, because she found in the days that followed that she had registered him with an inconvenient precision. The way he moved, unhurried and deliberate. The way he had looked at her without the social performance most men employed when introduced to a woman, no charm deployed, no studied interest or dismissal, just that direct and steady attention, as if he were simply noting an honest fact about the world. She put it aside. She was very good at putting things aside. He came into the store again 2 weeks later for seed and flour, and a length of leather cord, and this time Gerald was busy with another customer, and Eliza handled the transaction herself. She found his account, noted his purchase, quoted him the total, and accepted his payment. He said very little, and what he said was practical, but at the end of the transaction, when she was making the entry in the ledger and he was presumably ready to leave, he said, "How are you finding Redemption Creek, Miss Calloway?" The question was so plain and so genuine that she looked up again. "I find it straightforward," she said. "Is that a compliment?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and meant it. He nodded once, as if this confirmed something he had been considering, and left. She watched him go. Or rather, she was looking in that direction when he went, which was entirely different. It was the sheriff, Dale Briggs, who told her more about Cade Harlow, Not because she asked, but because Dale was a man who liked to talk when he was waiting for his weekly order of tobacco to be fetched, and he talked about people the way he talked about weather, as facts of the landscape that deserved understanding. "Cade Harlow's a good man," Dale said, leaning on the counter while Eliza wrote up his order. "Came out here from Texas about 4 years ago, built that spread on the East Ridge mostly with his own hands. He had a partner at the start, fellow named Rourke, but Rourke went back east after 2 winters. Cade stayed. Been running cattle and horses ever since. Good neighbor. Helps when there's trouble, doesn't manufacture any." "That's admirable," Eliza said, meaning it. "He's not a talking man," Dale continued. "Some people take that wrong, think he's cold, but he's not cold, he just watches before he speaks. My wife says that's rarer than silver out here." "Your wife sounds sensible," Eliza said. "She says the same about you," Dale said, which surprised her enough that she looked up. "You've made an impression, Miss Calloway. Most people who come out west with smooth hands and good diction either leave when the first hard winter hits or they go rigid trying to prove they can handle it. But you just got to work." Eliza did not know what to do with that, so she handed him his tobacco and his change and said, "Have a good afternoon, Sheriff." But she kept the words somewhere in her chest where they sat quietly and warm, and she was irritated with herself about it. The first real conversation she had with Cade Harlow happened in early June, when a sudden afternoon storm came down from the mountains, with the speed and indifference that she was still not used to from weather patterns in the east, where storms announced themselves over the course of days through barometric shifts and newspaper forecasts. Here the sky could be blazing blue at noon and cracked open with lightning by 2 in the afternoon, and that was exactly what happened on the day in question. She had been sent by Gerald to deliver a package of ordered goods to a ranch wife named Clara Munn, whose husband was laid up with a broken leg and could not come to town himself. It was a 2-mile walk on a clear road, and Eliza had walked it before and thought nothing of it. The storm, however, had different intentions. She was perhaps a mile from the Munn ranch, with the package tucked under her arm, when the sky went the color of a bruise, and the first crack of thunder rolled through the canyon walls like something enormous shifting in its sleep. The rain came an instant later, not politely but all at once, the way it always seemed to out here, as if the sky had decided to get the whole business over with. She had no shelter, and the road was already beginning to run with water, and she was standing in it soaking through when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to see Cade Harlow on a large, dark horse, coming toward her at a canter, his coat running with rain and his hat brim streaming. He pulled up beside her and said without preamble, "The Munn place is closer. Get up." She looked at the horse and then at him. "I am capable of walking," she said. "In this," he said. The lightning struck somewhere very close, close enough that she felt it in the roots of her teeth, and the thunder came so immediately after that it was not separated by enough silence to be a different event. The horse sidled and Cade steadied it with a hand and a word, and he looked at her with that steady gray attention and said, with something that was almost but not quite amusement, "Miss Calloway." She accepted his hand and got up behind him because she was not a fool. They rode to the Munn ranch in the rain, and she delivered her package to Clara Munn, who pressed both their hands and offered them coffee and a dry place to wait out the storm, which they accepted. Clara's husband Thomas hobbled to the doorway on his crutch to thank them and was told firmly by his wife to sit back down. They sat at Clara's kitchen table while the rain beat the windows, and Clara moved around her kitchen with the particular efficiency of a woman who has been managing alone and intends to keep doing so without complaint. Eliza held her coffee cup and felt the warmth come back into her fingers and realized she was sitting across a small table from Cade Harlow with no particular social script available to her. He was looking out the window at the rain. "Do you like it?" she asked. She was not sure why she asked it. "The country." He turned and looked at her, not surprised by the question. "Yes," he said. "I like that it's honest. The mountains don't pretend to be anything. The weather doesn't apologize." What's here is here, she considered that. I find that both comforting and terrifying, she said. Most true things are, he said. She looked at him then, really looked, with the careful attention she usually gave only to columns of numbers, and she thought that there was something about him that was also honest in that way, something that did not perform. It unsettled her because she had built her walls specifically for people who were honest, who would look straight at her and see the truth of what was there, and she had not accounted for someone like him when she designed the architecture. You came from Boston, he said. Not a question. Gerald talks, she said. Gerald talks, he agreed. He wrapped both hands around his own coffee cup and he said, You don't have to tell me anything about it. She was startled. About what? About whatever you came out here from, he said simply. I'm not asking. She stared at him. Most people asked, directly or through the civilized approach of fishing questions. Most people wanted the story, the narrative of a young woman alone who had come west, because it implied drama and they liked drama. Nobody had yet said outright that they were not asking. Thank you, she said, and she meant it so deeply that her voice came out slightly flatter than she intended, the way it did when she was fighting something she did not want to feel. He nodded once, as if that settled it, and looked back at the rain. The storm eased in an hour and he rode her back to town, and they parted with good evenings and nothing else, and she climbed the stairs to her room above the store and sat on the edge of her bed with the flying geese quilt in her hands folded in her lap, and told herself with great firmness that she was not interested in Cade Harlow. She was not going to be interested in anyone. She had come west to be alone and to work and to forget, and that was what she was doing. She woke up the next morning thinking about him anyway. The summer came on hard and hot, and Redemption Creek lived the way all small western towns lived in high summer, which is to say busily and loudly, and with the particular social density of people who had only each other for miles in any direction. There were dances at the community hall on the last Saturday of each month, which Eliza attended because Gerald and Dot attended, and they were her employers and something like her friends, and because Miss Pratt attended and had appointed herself Eliza's social companion with a cheerful forcefulness that Eliza had given up resisting. Cade Harlow attended the June dance, which Eliza noticed and told herself she had not noticed. He stood along the wall for most of the evening with his hat in his hands and talked to a couple of other ranchers, and once he danced with Clara Munn when Thomas pressed him into it, and Thomas could not dance himself with his legs still mending. He danced the way he did everything, without performance but with competence, and Clara laughed at something he said and he smiled, and Eliza looked away. He asked her to dance at the July dance. He appeared at her elbow while she was watching Miss Pratt be twirled extravagantly by the blacksmith's apprentice, and he said, "Would you like to dance, Miss Calloway?" With the same directness he brought to everything, no performance, no particular charm, just an honest question. She said yes before she had fully decided to. He was a steady dancer, which she had half expected. He held her correctly and guided without overriding, and he did not try to impress her with any flourish. The fiddle was playing something lively, and they moved through it, and she was aware of the warmth of his hand at her back and his other hand holding hers, and the fact that he smelled of clean soap and horses and something faintly of pine, and she focused very deliberately on the music. "You've been avoiding me," he said, pleasantly, not accusingly. She was so startled that she almost missed a step. "I have done no such thing. You look at the shelves when I come into the store," he said. "Before, you looked at the ledger." She stared at him. "That is an extremely specific observation." "I pay attention," he said. The music went on around them and people spun past and the lanterns swung from the rafters and Eliza felt something shift in her chest, something she had mortared over with great care and effort, shifting like a stone in a wall when the ground settles after rain. "You are very direct," she said. "I find it wastes less of everyone's time," he said. "Most people find it uncomfortable," she said. "Do you?" He asked, and he looked at her with those clear gray eyes, and she had the profound and unwelcome sensation of being seen, of having someone look at her and perceive not the composed and capable woman she had assembled from the wreckage of the last year, but something further in, something she had not shown anyone since Boston, since before Edmund had stood in her mother's parlor and informed her that she was not enough. She looked away. "Yes," she said. "Sometimes. I'll try to be less direct," he said. "Don't," she said, before she could stop herself. They finished the dance in silence, and he thanked her, and she went to find Holt and the safety of conversation about Mrs. Munn's new curtains, which Dot had strong opinions about, and Eliza was grateful for every single one of them. In August, a situation arose at the store that required Cade Harlow's practical knowledge, and Gerald, with the innocent ruthlessness of a good-natured man who saw exactly what was in front of him and thought it was probably for the best, sent Eliza to ask him about it. The situation was this. Gerald had been offered a purchase arrangement by a man named Hollis Draper, a cattle broker who had arrived in Redemption Creek 2 weeks prior, and was known to the sheriff as someone who had been involved in questionable dealings in 2 other counties. The arrangement involved Gerald extending significant credit against future cattle receipts, in a way that Eliza had examined from every angle and could not make work honestly. She had written out her concerns in clear figures and clear language, but Gerald was being swayed by Hollis Draper's easy manner and promises, and Eliza needed someone whose understanding of the cattle trade could reinforce her bookkeeping argument before Gerald made a costly mistake. Dale Briggs had pointed her to Cade Harlow as the man in the region who knew cattle prices and cattle dealings better than anyone, and so Eliza rode out to his spread on the East Ridge on a Wednesday morning with her concerns written out in a neat document, and a determination to make this entirely professional and brief. The Harlow spread was not what she had expected, though she could not have said exactly what she had expected. It was a working ranch, clean and practical, with a main house of good timber and a wide porch that faced the mountains, a barn and corrals and several outbuildings, all of it maintained with the same deliberate competence that characterized the man himself. There were horses in the near pasture, a half-dozen of them, the kind of horses that made you look twice, deep-chested and clean-limbed, and she admired them despite herself. He came out of the barn when she rode up, wiping his hands on a cloth, and looked at her horse and then at her with an expression that was open and simply interested. "Miss Calloway," he said. "Mr. Harlow," she said. "Gerald Holt is about to make a financial error, and Dale Briggs says you're the person best placed to help me prevent it," he said. "Come inside and tell me about it." He made coffee, real coffee, better than Gerald's, and she sat across from him at a broad kitchen table and laid out her document and went through it with him point by point. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated, and he read the figures she had written with the alert focus of someone genuinely thinking rather than waiting for his turn to speak. "This Draper," he said when she finished. "What does he look like?" She described him, and Cade's expression went from focused to resolved. "I know who he is," he said. "He worked a scheme like this in Pueblo 2 years ago." 3 merchants extended credit on cattle receipts that never materialized because the cattle had already been committed to a buyer in New Mexico. The men who set it up collected the credit, the cattle moved on, and the merchants were left with nothing. "That is exactly what I suspected," Eliza said, with a satisfaction that was partly professional and partly the relief of being believed without having to fight for it. "I'll come into town with you and talk to Gerald," he said, "and I'll talk to Dale. If Draper is running the same game here, Dale needs to know." She looked at him across the table. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I just needed the cattle knowledge to support the figures." "Gerald's a good man," Cade said simply, "and you came out here to ask for help, which I imagine was not easy for you." She stiffened slightly. "What makes you say that?" He looked at her levelly. "Because you handle everything yourself if you can," he said. "You walked 2 miles in building whether to deliver a package rather than wait a day. You spent 3 weeks rebuilding a 15-year ledger that most people would have simply set on fire. When I asked you to dance, you looked like you were calculating the risk of it before you said yes. The kitchen was quiet except for the coffee cooling between them. Outside, one of the horses called from the pasture. "Is that a criticism?" she said. "No," he said. "It's an observation. There's a difference." She looked down at her document, at the clean columns of figures that told a simple and damning story, and she said, very quietly, "I learned to handle things myself because the people I trusted to help me did not." She had not meant to say that. She felt the heat rise briefly in her face, and she pressed her lips together and gathered her papers with more deliberateness than necessary. "Eliza," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name, and it landed with a weight she was not prepared for, gentle and serious at once. She looked up. "I'm not him," he said, "whoever it was." She breathed in slowly and looked at him across the table, and he looked back, steady and unhurried, no pressure in it, just the simple and devastating honesty of a man who said what he meant. "I know," she said. And then, because she needed to be moving before she said anything else, she said, "We should go into town." They went into town. Cade talked to Gerald and to Dale Briggs, and by afternoon Holly's Draper had been firmly declined, and then quietly encouraged by Dale to take his business to a different county, which he did with the speed of a man who recognized official interest and did not want any. Gerald pumped Cade's hand with enormous gratitude and then turned to Eliza and pumped hers as well, which was better. Cade walked his horse beside hers on the way back to the edge of town, and when they reached the point where the East Ridge Road split from the main road, they stopped. "Thank you," she said. "You did the work," he said. "I just confirmed it." She held her horse still and looked at the mountains above the town, the long blue ridgeline against the high summer sky, and she said, "I came west to stop being afraid." She was not sure where that came from, only that it was true. "How's that going?" he asked. "Better today than yesterday," she said. He smiled then, really smiled, and it changed his whole face, not because he became a different person, but because it revealed more of the person already there, and she felt something in her chest pull toward him with a warmth and a wanting that she recognized and feared and did not immediately wall off, which was in itself significant. She turned her horse and rode back to town. She thought about him for the rest of the week and hated herself only slightly for it. At the end of August, Dot Holt sat Eliza down at the kitchen table behind the store, where Dot conducted the majority of what she called real conversations as distinguished from over-the-counter conversations, and said, "Eliza, honey, I am going to say something and you can tell me to mind my business if you want." "I won't tell you to mind your business," Eliza said, because Dot was one of the few people she had allowed genuinely close, and she had earned some latitude. "Cade Harlow has come into this store more times in the last 2 months than he has in the last 2 years combined," Dot said, "and every single time, he manages to end up at your end of the counter, and you manage to be looking at the shelf or the ledger or the wall. And I just want to say that whatever happened to you before you came here, and I know something happened, you don't have to tell me what, but whatever it wasn't Cade." Eliza looked at her hands on the table. "He's a good man," Dot said. "The genuinely good kind. Not the kind that's good because it costs him nothing, but the kind that's good because he decided to be, and he keeps deciding it every day. And he looks at you like you're a mountain he's trying to learn." Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What if I let him in and he sees something he doesn't want?" Dot reached across the table and covered Eliza's hands with her own, warm and practical. "Then you'll know," she said. "But honey, from what I can see, he's already been looking and he keeps coming back. Draw your own conclusions." Eliza drew them, slowly and carefully, and with the methodical attention she gave to everything important over the following weeks. She began, cautiously, to stop looking at the shelf. She began, instead, to look back. And when she looked back, she found him already there, and the expression on his face was the same calm and attentive steadiness it always was, as if he had been waiting without impatience for exactly as long as necessary, and she felt the first genuine crack in the architecture of the walls she had so carefully constructed, felt it not as a failure but as light coming through. She went riding with him one Sunday in early September because Miss Pratt suggested it with suspicious casualness, and because when he had mentioned in passing at the store that the aspens would be turning color on the East Ridge and the view from up there was worth the ride, she had said before the wall could reassemble itself, "I'd like to see that." He had looked at her with those clear gray eyes and said, "Sunday morning, then. I'll bring the horses." He brought 2 horses, his dark gelding and a calm bay mare that he had clearly chosen for her with thought, and they rode up through the pines as the morning light came sideways and gold through the trees. The aspens were beginning their turn, the leaves still mostly green but touched at their edges with yellow and gold, trembling in the faint mountain breeze with that particular sound that aspen leaves make, 1,000 small percussions, like water or breathing. They rode without talking for a long while, and it was not uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who did not need to fill space with words, which Eliza had not experienced before, and she noticed it with the quiet surprise of finding a room in a house you thought you knew completely. They reached an open shelf of rock on the ridge with the whole long valley below them, the town of Redemption Creek a collection of small rectangles in the distance, the creek catching the morning sun, the mountains rising in every direction in shades of blue and purple and gray. She brought the mare to a stop and looked out at it and felt something very large and very quiet open in her chest. "You were right," she said. "I usually am about things worth looking at," he said, and there was nothing boastful in it, just the same plainness as everything else he said, and she laughed, which surprised her, a real laugh. He turned to look at her when she laughed, and the expression on his face then was something she would carry for a very long time. They sat on that shelf of rock for an hour, the horses grazing in the thin grass behind them, and they talked. Not about anything that required courage at first, about the land and the cattle and the winter he had spent alone in his first year when the snow came early, and he had been essentially snowbound for 3 months, and had read every book he owned twice, and then begun reading them backward for variety. She laughed at that too. Then she said, because the height and the clean air and the aspen leaves and the silence had taken something out of her resistance, "His name was Edmund Fairchild. We were to be married last March. He ended the engagement in February for a woman with a larger inheritance. And I know that sounds like a simple story, but it was not simple at all. It was the kind of thing that makes you wonder if any of what you thought was real was real." Cade listened without interrupting or offering swift comfort. "My family was kind about it in the way that kind people are when they think you've been foolish," she said. "And maybe I had been. I had believed what he showed me and not looked for what he was hiding, and after that I found I couldn't trust my own perception of people, which is a fairly difficult thing to live with." "That sounds lonely," he said. "It was," she said. "It is." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I think it's harder to trust after you've been wrong about someone than it is to trust when you've never been wrong. Being wrong about a person, specifically about the kind of person they are, it does something particular. It makes you distrust the evidence of your own eyes, and that's not foolishness. That's damage." She looked at him. "But your eyes aren't wrong," he said. "Not in my experience of you. You saw through Draper's numbers before anyone else. You see Gerald's weaknesses and his strengths, and you manage both without hurting his pride. You see this valley." He paused. "I think you see me too, a little, and I wonder what you see." She held his gaze for a long time, longer than she would have allowed herself even a month ago. "Someone honest," she said. "Someone who does not use charm as a weapon or helpfulness as a negotiation. Someone who watches before he speaks and speaks only what he means." She paused. "Someone who frightens me a little." "I know," he said, and he said it with the same gentleness he had used when he said her name across the kitchen table, the gentleness of a person who was not going to use what he knew. They rode back down in the middle of the morning, and he left her at the edge of town, and she walked the mare's reins back to where he had tied her at the hitching post, and she stood in the street with the sun on her face and one hand on the mare's warm neck, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the tentative and terrifying sensation of wanting to be known. She let it sit there. She did not wall it off. She just let it sit there and breathe. October brought the first cold, and with it a complication, which arrived in the form of a letter. The letter was from her mother, which was not unusual. Her mother wrote regularly with a mixture of affection and social news and gentle, persistent suggestions. But this letter contained, tucked inside it like something her mother thought might slip past unexamined, a brief note in a different hand, which turned out upon examination to be the hand of Edmund Fairchild. The note said that the other woman, whose name was Harriet Vance, had broken the engagement herself after 6 months, and that Edmund had spent considerable time in reflection, and had come to understand that he had made a grave error, and that he hoped Eliza might be open to a correspondence with a view to, possibly, a renewed understanding. She read it once. She set it on her desk. She went and did the day's accounts with focused and determined calm. Then she came back and read it again and felt, to her own considerable surprise, very little. Not the devastation she might have expected, not even the bitterness she had carried through the long winter in Boston. Instead, she felt something like the clarity that comes when you put a column of figures through a second calculation, and the same answer comes back, confirming what you already knew. What she knew was this: Edmund Fairchild had looked at her and seen a calculation. And the reason she had believed otherwise was that she had been young and he had been skilled at performance, and she had not yet met a man like the one up on the East Ridge. She wrote back to her mother that same afternoon, a warm and genuine letter, and she addressed the matter of Edmund's note in 2 sentences. That she wished him well, that she had found in her Western life something considerably better than anything she had left behind, and that the question was closed. She meant every word. 2 days later, she went to the Harlow spread on the pretext of delivering a message from Gerald about an order, which was genuine enough, and she found Cade in the corral working with a young horse, a sorrel gelding that was still learning the world, and expressed this by sidewinding and snorting at everything. He saw her and lifted a hand in greeting and finished what he was doing, and she leaned on the fence and watched him work. He was very patient with the horse. He did not get louder when the horse got nervous. He got quieter. He moved to give the horse more space and then asked for less and gave it again. And slowly, over the course of 20 minutes, the horse stopped sidewinding and began to pay attention. And at the end of it, it stood with its head low and one ear pointed at Cade in a posture of provisional trust that was quite clear even to someone who knew very little about horses. She thought about that as he came to the fence. "You have a message from Gerald," he said. "Yes," she said, and gave it to him, and they discussed it briefly. Then she said, "I received a letter from Boston." He looked at her. "From Edmund Fairchild," she said. "He has discovered that he preferred me to Harriet Vance and has expressed a desire to reopen a correspondence." Cade's expression did not change exactly, but something in it went very still, the way he went still when he was thinking. "And what did you reply?" he asked. "That I wished him well and that the question was closed," she said. He studied her for a moment with those clear gray eyes. "Are you certain?" he asked, and his voice was level, no pressure in it, but she understood what was underneath the question. "Yes," she said, "completely." He nodded once. Then, with the same deliberate lack of performance that characterized everything he did, he said, "Eliza, I would like to take you to dinner." She was so accustomed to him that she almost missed the significance, the slight difference in register, the way he used her name and the directness of the proposal, no circling, no social maneuvering. "To dinner," she said. "At the hotel if you're willing," he said. "They have a decent dining room, and I believe they are serving beef on Fridays." She looked at him standing on the other side of the corral fence with the sorrel gelding nosing at his sleeve, and the mountains behind him going gold in the afternoon light, and she thought that this was the most unlikely and the most inevitable thing that had ever happened to her. "Friday, then," she said. He smiled, and she went warm with it, and she rode back to town in the October chill with her cheeks red and her heart doing something in her chest that she decided, this time, not to argue with. The dinner at the hotel, was a remarkable thing. They were neither of them demonstrative people, and neither of them played at ease they did not feel. And so what they had was something more valuable, which was honesty, the honest shyness of two people who wanted to be known and were frightened of it, held up against the safety of two people who trusted each other enough to be frightened. He told her about Texas, where he had grown up, one of 5 children on a spread outside San Antonio, and about the years after the war when the family land had been carved up and sold, and there had been nothing left to inherit, and he had worked cattle drives for 2 years before deciding that he would rather build something of his own, slowly, than chase someone else's money across someone else's land. She told him about Boston, really told him, not the social version but the real one, the family that was loving but measured, the education that was broad but bounded at the edges by expectation. The long, careful courtship with Edmund that she now understood had been always more about social transaction than about genuine seeing, and how she had not understood that until she had come here and been seen differently. "By you," she said, and then held her breath a little. "By me," he confirmed, and reached across the table and put his hand over hers for a moment, just a moment, and then moved it back, and it was enough. They walked out into the October night, and the air was cold and sharp, and the stars in this high, clear country were ridiculous in their abundance, and they stood in the street outside the hotel, and she thought that she had never seen so many stars in Boston. The city light drowned them, and she had not until this moment understood what she had been missing. "Cade," she said, and she used his name the way he had used hers, with weight. "Yes," he said. "I need you to be patient with me," she said. "Because I am going to keep building those walls for a while yet. I cannot seem to stop, even when I don't want to." "I know," he said. "I can wait." "You've been waiting," she said. "I don't mind it," he said. "I told you, the honest things are worth waiting for." She reached out in the dark and found his hand and held it. There in the main street of Redemption Creek, with the stars overhead and the cold coming down from the mountains. And he held hers back with a steadiness that was entirely like him. No urgency, just presence. And she thought that this was what she had not known to want before she came west. Not rescue, not performance, not charm, just this. A hand in the dark and someone who did not require her to be anything other than exactly what she was. November was cold. The high country winters came in the way that Cade had warned her they would, not gradually but with decision. And by the middle of the month, the first real snow had come down from the peaks and settled in the valley, and the mornings were a particular hard-edged blue that was beautiful in a way that made your chest ache. She had Sunday suppers at his place twice in November, and he had supper at Gerald and Dot's table 3 times when he came to town for supplies, and Dot, who operated with the benign persistence of a woman who has decided something good should happen and intends to assist, would hear nothing of him leaving without eating first. The walls were coming down, not all at once but steadily, piece by piece, the way a stone wall comes apart when the mortar is old and the stones decide to find their own level. She noticed it happening and no longer fought it. She told him, over a shared meal at his table while snow fell quietly outside the window, about the night in the parlor when Edmund had spoken, about exactly how she had felt, not the composed version she had told in September but the real one, the version where her legs had gone strange, and she had not trusted herself to speak for a long time after he left, and she had sat in the parlor alone in the failing afternoon light. He listened, and when she finished he said, "You had every right to fall apart. I'm more interested in the fact that you didn't." "I did a little," she said, "privately." "That's where it counts," he said. She looked at him across the table. "How did you know?" she said. "When you looked at me that first day in Gerald's store and you kept coming back. How did you know there was anything worth coming back for?" He thought about that seriously, the way he thought about everything. "I didn't know," he said. "I saw someone who was capable and careful, and lonely in a way they thought they were hiding. And I thought, that's someone who has been let down badly enough to stop trusting. And I thought, if she ever trusted again, she'd be worth knowing." "That's a considerable assumption to make about a stranger," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but you let me make it." She realized, sitting there with the snow coming down and the fire in his hearth making good light and the supper dishes between them, that she was happy. Not the cautious, provisional happiness she had assembled for herself out of good work and useful purpose and the company of good people, but an actual happiness, rooted and warm and facing the right direction. She was terrified of it, and she was not going to wall it off. In December, two things happened that between them changed everything. The first was that Gerald Holt, with no warning at all, had a quiet conversation with Eliza in which he told her that his brother in Denver was unwell, and that he and Dot had been discussing, for some time, the possibility of selling the store and moving to Denver to be near his brother, and that they had been holding off in part because they were concerned about what she would do, but that they had decided recently that she was considerably more capable of managing than they had given her credit for, and that the offer they wanted to make her was this: that she buy the store from them, or manage it on their behalf with a proper contractual arrangement, because they trusted her completely, and she had turned the store's accounts from a source of anxiety into a source of genuine security, and they did not want to simply abandon her. Eliza sat with this for a full day. She looked at the numbers, which she knew better than anyone, and she looked at the town, which she had come to love in the practical, clear-eyed way that she loved most things that were honestly themselves, and she thought about what she wanted her life to look like. Then she went to the East Ridge and found Cade in the barn and told him what Gerald had proposed. He listened and he said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to manage it," she said. "I want to stay here." A pause. "I wanted to tell you before I told Gerald." He looked at her with those gray eyes and she felt the walls come down another section, a whole wide section, and the light came through. "I'm glad you told me," he said. "I want you to stay." "Yes," she said. "Yes," he said simply and completely. "Eliza, yes." She breathed in cold barn air and breathed out, and she said, "Then I'm staying." The second thing that happened in December was that Cade Harlow rode into town on a Thursday afternoon, not to buy supplies, and found Eliza in the back room of the store going over accounts for the transfer arrangement with Gerald, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said, "I have something to ask you." She looked up from the ledger, and her heart, which she was getting better at listening to, said something clear and important. "Ask it," she said. He came and sat across from her at the small work table, and he said, "I know you came out here to build walls. And I know I've been dismantling them, or watching you dismantle them, and I want you to know that I see what that's cost you and I don't take it lightly." She waited. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because you need someone to take care of you, because you clearly don't, and not because it would be convenient, because I imagine we'll argue about the beef prices and the store accounts, and whether the fence line runs where I think it runs, but because you are the most real person I have ever known, and because when I look at you I see someone who decided to come west and start over and then actually did it, and because I have not once, in all the months of watching you, seen you be anything other than honest, and I think that's worth more than anything." The back room of Gerald Holt's general store was not a particularly romantic setting, with its shelves of reserve stock and its smell of lamp oil and flour, but she found she did not mind at all. "There are things about me you don't know yet," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm asking for the time to learn them." "I am not easy," she said. "I am organized to a degree that some people find insufferable, and I have strong opinions about the correct method of keeping accounts, and I do not suffer foolishness." "I noticed," he said. "And I am still working on the walls," she said. "It may take a while." "I know," he said, and he smiled, that smile that changed everything in his face, and she felt it all the way through. "Yes," she said. "Cade, yes." He reached across the table, and she took his hand, and they sat there in the back room of the general store, and it was, she would tell him later, the best accounting she had ever done. They were married in February, when the snow was still on the ground, and the creek ran black and cold between white banks, and the mountain stood enormous and indifferent above the small, warm town that had become her place. The ceremony was at the church, officiated by the pastor, attended by almost everyone in Redemption Creek, and a good number of people from the surrounding ranches and farms who came in for it, because in a small community a marriage is a communal event, and because Cade Harlow was known and liked, and because Eliza Calloway had in less than a year become a fixture of the town in the way that capable and honest people always do, not by announcement but by daily presence. Dot cried, which she had announced she would not do, and then did loudly and without apology. Miss Pratt stood with Eliza as her witness and looked as if she had personally arranged the whole thing, which she had largely not, except for the flowers, which were winterberry and pine boughs, and which she had assembled with great determination despite the February cold. Dale Briggs stood with Cade and afterward shook his hand with the quiet, genuine pleasure of a man whose opinion of the world has been confirmed. The reception was at the community hall with a fiddle player and 2 guitars and more food than anyone could eat, and a dancing that went until midnight and would have gone longer except that the temperature dropped to something serious outside, and sensible people began to remember they had stock to tend in the morning. She danced with her husband, which was a word she was trying out in her mind with the pleased surprise of finding that it fit perfectly, and he held her the way he always did, steady and present and without performance, and she put her head briefly against his chest and felt his heart beat there, and thought that she had come west to forget a broken past and instead had found the ground under her feet. They went home to his house on the East Ridge, their house now, and the snow was blue in the moonlight and the stars were extravagant, and she stood on the porch for a moment before going inside and looked out at the mountains and at the valley below where the lights of the town were small and warm, and she felt, fully and without reservation, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Spring came, as it always did, with the confident extravagance of the Colorado high country, the snowmelt running loud in the creek, and the aspens leafing out in a green so new it was almost yellow, and the meadows filling with flowers that she had not known the names of before she came here and now knew all of them, because she had asked, and he had told her, walking the land on Sunday evenings with the easy propriety of 2 people entirely comfortable with each other. Blue columbine and Indian paintbrush, and the low white cups of avalanche lily near the snowmelt, and the long golden heads of mules ear nodding in the mountain wind. She had taken formal management of Holt's General Store, as it continued to be called by the town even after Gerald and Dot departed for Denver in the spring, and she had reorganized it top to bottom and improved the accounts to a point where the store was earning significantly more than it had in years, and she had also hired a young man named Frank Reddy, the son of one of the outlying farmers, as a counter-assistant, which allowed her to divide her time better between the store and the ranch. Because the ranch needed managing too, and she had opinions about it. Cade found this both challenging and, she suspected, secretly delightful. He had run the Harlow spread alone for 4 years with his own system, which worked, but which she identified in its first month of examination as having 3 significant inefficiencies in the buying of feed, a pattern in the cattle pricing that meant he was consistently selling at the low end of market when better timing would improve his return, and a record-keeping system that, while better than Gerald's, was not as good as it could be. She told him all of this over supper one April evening with her papers spread on the table between the plates. He looked at the papers, he looked at her, he said, "Are you always going to do this?" "Yes," she said. "Are you going to object?" He thought about it with genuine consideration. "No," he said, "the feed buying alone will save enough to cover the wire I need for the north pasture. That's what I calculated," she said. He reached across the papers and took her hand and kissed it, with the easy, certain affection of a man who is entirely settled in his love. And she felt the warmth of it run from her hand to her heart, and she thought that there was nothing in any ledger anywhere that recorded what she had here, and that was the one category of valuable things that did not require accounting. In the summer of 1879, 14 months after Eliza Calloway had stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Creek with her trunk and her carpet bag and her very well-built walls, she found herself sitting on the porch of the ranch house in the long evening light watching Cade work with the sorrel, which was no longer a young horse uncertain of the world but a finished horse, 4 years old and confident and responsive, and she thought about what she was going to tell him. She had been turning it over for a week with the methodical care she brought to important matters, examining it from every angle, making certain of the fact before she spoke it, because she did not speak things she was not certain of, and she was certain of this. She waited until he came up to the porch and sat beside her with his coffee and the long day settling around them, and she said, "Cade," he said, looking out at the meadow. "We're going to have a child," she said. He went still for a moment in the way he went still when something hit him deeply. That particular quiet that meant he was feeling something he needed a moment to hold properly. Then he turned and looked at her with those clear gray eyes, and there was in them something she had never seen from him before, which was what she could only describe as pure, uncomplicated joy, the kind that had no performance in it because it was too large for performance. "Eliza," he said. "Yes," she said, and she was smiling so hard her face ached with it. He set his coffee down and took her face in both hands and kissed her, and when he pulled back she was laughing and he was too, which was not his usual mode and was therefore precious, and he kept his hands on her face as if he were learning it again. "When?" he said. "February," she said. "I think, given the calendar." "February," he repeated, and something shifted in his face that was warmth and seriousness at once. "A February baby. In this house," she said, "with this mountain and those aspens and that ridiculous creek that floods every spring and you insist is charming." "It is charming," he said. "It floods my road," she said. "Charming," he repeated and kissed her again, and she let him wholly and without reservation, which was the greatest change of all, from the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach to this woman, here, in her own life, letting herself be loved. The pregnancy was healthy, and the town of Redemption Creek, which had appointed itself collectively interested in the welfare of the Harlow family, was extremely attentive about it. Miss Pratt brought books. Clara Munn brought remedies and advice that was surprisingly practical given that Clara had 3 children and had managed all 3 essentially by herself while Thomas was working. Dale Briggs's wife, a small brisk woman named Hattie, came out to the ranch twice with prepared food and what she called necessary conversation, which turned out to be a very direct and useful overview of what to expect, delivered without sentiment or alarm. Eliza worked at the store until November and then reduced her hours, which she did with great reluctance and only because Frank Reddy had proven himself more than capable, and because Cade sat her down and said, with his characteristic plainness, "You can run the store and a ranch and grow a person simultaneously, but I'd like you to consider that you don't have to prove all of it at the same time to the same people." She had looked at him for a moment and then said, "That was very astute." "I have my moments," he said. She had laughed and conceded and cut her hours, and used the time instead to sit on the porch in the November cold with a wool blanket and her ledger balanced on her knees, and the mountains doing whatever the mountains were doing, which was being enormous and ancient and entirely unconcerned with her schedule, and she found that she did not mind slowing down as much as she had expected. There was a pleasure in it, in the particular permission of this season of her life, a pleasure she would not have allowed herself before she came here, before she had learned the difference between strength and armoring. The baby came in February. The winter of 1880 in Redemption Creek was cold and deep, and the night of the 12th of February it snowed hard enough to cover the windows halfway up, and in that snow and that cold, with Hattie Briggs in attendance and Cade keeping the fire high and the water hot in his hand, when she wanted it, available without fuss, their son was born. He was born at midnight, as the snow eased and the cold deepened and somewhere outside an owl called in the dark, and when he drew his first breath and announced himself to the world with considerable force, Eliza held him against her chest and felt a love so absolute and so physical that it was like the mountains, too large for any ledger, too real for any wall. Cade sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with that expression she loved, that open, unperformed feeling, and he said very quietly, "He's here." "He's here," she said. They named him Thomas James Harlow, Thomas for Thomas Munn, who had been a good neighbor and a decent man, and James for Cade's father, who had died when Cade was 20, and whom he had spoken of with the particular fond grief of someone who learned what he valued by losing it. Thomas James Harlow came into the world in February and was by March already in possession of everyone in Redemption Creek who laid eyes on him, because he had his mother's alert dark eyes and his father's steady attention, and a disposition of interested curiosity about everything that was pointed at him, which at 1 month of age included the ceiling beams, the lamp flame, his father's hat, and the cat that had arrived at the ranch unannounced the previous autumn and been allowed to stay, because Eliza could not locate a logical argument against it. Spring came again, the third spring she had seen in this country, and it was the best one yet, because she was standing on the porch with her son on her hip and her husband in the corrals below, and the aspens in their new green and the creek running loud and cold, and she realized, all the way home, not the home she had left, not the brownstone in Boston with its velvet curtains and its social ledgers. This home, which she had found at the end of a stagecoach ride made in desperation and grief, and the grim determination to put enough distance between herself and her broken past that she might eventually stop feeling it. She had found it by accident, or not by accident, by the particular mercy of a town that needed an honest bookkeeper and a man who watched before he spoke and kept watching after he understood what he saw, and who had stood in Gerald Holt's store on a Tuesday afternoon and looked at her with eyes the color of a sky before a storm and not looked away. She had built walls, and he had not attempted to break them down from the outside. He had simply been there, constant and honest and unhurried, until she had opened the door herself, which was the only way any real entry is ever made. Thomas made a sound of demand in her arms, and she shifted him and laughed, and Cade looked up from the corrals below and lifted his hand, and she lifted hers back, and the mountains stood above them in the spring morning as they had stood through everything, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and Eliza Harlow felt nothing like a woman who had come west to forget. She felt like a woman who had come west to begin. 2 years on from that February birth, the Harlow Ranch on the East Ridge had grown in the incremental, deliberate way that Cade approached everything, each season bringing a new improvement reasoned out and achieved without overreach. He had expanded the horse operation, finding a market for well-trained cow horses among the incoming ranchers who were filing claims throughout the San Juan Basin and needed reliable working stock. He had improved the north pasture fencing, which Eliza had budgeted with precision and which had come in under cost largely because he had found a supplier in Durango that she had located by writing 3 letters and comparing responses. She had run Holt's General Store, which by the summer of 1881 she had formally purchased, the paperwork signed in Gerald's handwriting from Denver, where he confirmed his brother had recovered, and that he and Dot were well, and that they could not be happier about how things had turned out. She had renamed it Calloway Harlow Supply Company, which the town accepted after approximately 2 weeks of calling it Eliza's store, which she also accepted because she found she did not mind it. The store was doing well. She had expanded the credit ledger to include a careful and sensibly administered arrangement for outlying families who needed supplies through the winter, but whose cash did not flow evenly across the calendar year, something the previous system had not accommodated, and the result was that her customers were loyal and her accounts were healthy, and the system worked because it was honest on both sides, which she had always believed was the only basis for a system that lasts. Thomas, at 2 years old, was a small and vigorous person with strong opinions about most things, particularly breakfast, the cat, and his father's horses, which he intended to ride as soon as anyone would permit it, which Cade had begun accommodating in the mildest possible way by setting the boy on the broad back of the oldest and most patient mare in the string while walking her in a slow circle in the corral. Thomas found this entirely satisfactory and demanded it daily with the absolute conviction of someone who has identified what they need and sees no reason to be subtle about it. Eliza watched from the fence and felt the fullness of it, the dailiness of it, which was the best part, better even than the grand moments, the wedding and the birth and the morning on the East Ridge shelf with the aspens, though all of those were woven into her as well. It was the dailiness that was the real thing, the mornings with coffee and ledgers and his voice from the other room and Thomas's sounds from his bed, the evenings on the porch. The arguments about fence lines and cattle timing that were genuine arguments, plainly conducted and resolved without lasting damage, because they were both capable of being wrong and had agreed, early, that being wrong together was better than being right alone. She thought about this one evening in the summer of 1881, sitting at the kitchen table after Thomas was in bed, with her own accounts open before her and Cade reading at the other end of the table with the lamp between them, and she said without planning to, "I want to tell you something." He looked up from his book. "Before I came here," she said, "I decided I was done with trusting, with opening. I had a specific plan which was to be completely capable and completely closed and to live a good and sufficient and entirely protected life. I had the plan very well worked out." He waited. "You ruined it," she said. He smiled. "I know," he said. "I'm very glad you did," she said. He reached across the table and closed his hand over hers, and the lamp made its warm circle of light, and outside the summer dark was full of cricket song, and somewhere up in the mountains a night wind was moving through the pines, and she turned her hand over and held his back. "So am I," he said. By the fall of 1881 she was expecting again. She told him in September on the porch in the evening, in the same way she had told him the first time, because some things deserve repetition when they are good. He set down his coffee and took her face in both hands and kissed her, and Thomas, who had escaped his bed by the engineering of climbing over the crib rail, toddled out onto the porch in his nightshirt with the cat behind him and wanted to know what was happening. "You're going to have a brother or a sister," Cade told him. Thomas considered this. He said, "Cat." "Not a cat," Cade said. Thomas looked at the cat. The cat looked back. Thomas appeared to accept the situation. Eliza laughed so hard she had to set her coffee down. The second child was born in April, in the good warm spring, and was a girl. And she came into the world as the aspens were just beginning to bud out, and the creek was at its fullest, and the meadow below the house was showing the first green of new grass. They named her Frances Dorothea Harlow. Frances for no one in particular, but because the name felt right, and Dorothea for Dot Holt in Denver, who received the letter announcing it and wrote back a reply that was almost entirely exclamation marks and was tucked into the store's correspondence file by Eliza and kept there. Frances was from the beginning a different person from her brother, quieter and more watchful, with her father's gray eyes and her mother's particular quality of seeing things carefully before responding to them. And Eliza looked at her daughter sometimes and thought that here, in this small face, was the person she might have become under different circumstances. Someone who learned caution from the world rather than from being hurt by it, who could perhaps be taught that some doors were worth opening. She intended to teach her that. She intended also to teach Thomas, and to let Cade teach them both in his own way, which was primarily by example, by being a man who meant what he said, and said what he meant, and treated the people around him with the same honest respect he brought to working a horse, which was to say firmly, fairly, and with enormous patience. Redemption Creek went on being itself, which is to say a small and complicated and largely decent town growing slowly into its own future, as all such towns do. The railroad that everyone had been predicting would come through in 1880 came instead in 1882, and with it came new people and new commerce and new complications, as well as the undeniable convenience of goods that no longer had to come by wagon from Durango. Eliza adjusted her supply accounts accordingly and expanded one side of the store to accommodate the increase in available goods and the resulting increase in customers. Sheriff Dale Briggs was reelected twice and showed no signs of stopping. Miss Pratt married the schoolteacher who came to replace her when she announced her retirement from teaching, which led to a good deal of confusion because they were both schoolteachers and had to decide which one was retiring, and they resolved this by both teaching, which the school board found irregular but could not genuinely argue with because the children learned better with two teachers than one. Clara and Thomas Munn's leg healed fully, and he was farming as well as before, and they had added a room to their house, and Clara came into the store on Saturdays with her children trailing behind her, and was one of Eliza's best customers and one of her better friends, and they had developed over 3 years the kind of friendship that is built entirely on honesty and practicality and mutual respect, which is the most durable kind. On an evening in October of 1882, with the aspens in full gold and the air carrying the particular sharpness of the turning season, Eliza sat on the East Ridge shelf of rock that had been theirs since their first real conversation, the place where she had looked out over the valley and felt something she was not yet ready to name. She had come up alone today, on a Sunday afternoon, while Thomas was helping his father in the corrals with the deliberate importance of a 3-year-old who believes himself indispensable, and Frances was sleeping in the house under the watch of Hattie Briggs, who had come to visit and found the baby arrangement more than sufficient reason to stay. She sat on the rock with the whole valley below her, and the mountains on every side, and the aspens burning gold in the afternoon light. And she thought about the woman who had stood on a stagecoach platform in the spring of 1878 with her trunk and her carpet bag and her walls. And she thought about the woman sitting here now. And she thought that the distance between those two women was not years or miles, but something that did not have a clean accounting category. It was the distance between the self you build to survive and the self you become when survival is no longer the only requirement. She heard hoofbeats below and looked down and saw Cade coming up the ridge path on his dark gelding, alone, which meant Thomas had accepted a handoff, and Hattie Briggs was managing both children, which she was entirely capable of and would consider a pleasure. He came up to the shelf and dismounted and tied his horse to a pine and came and sat beside her on the rock, and for a while they just looked at the valley together. "You came up here alone," he said. "I wanted to think," she said. "Did you?" "Yes," she said. "I thought about everything that's happened from the beginning. Conclusions." He said, which was a word he used when she was working through something and he wanted to know what the ledger said. She leaned against him, which she did easily and without ceremony now, and he put his arm around her and she said, "I came out here to forget." "I know," he said, "but I didn't forget," she said. I found that the past stopped being the main thing. It's still there. What Edmund did, how it felt. What my family was and wasn't. None of it's gone. But it's not the thing I'm facing anymore. I'm facing this." She gestured at the valley, at the mountains, at all of it. "You, Thomas, Frances, the store, this stupid and beautiful rock." "The rock is excellent," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." She turned and looked at him, at the profile she had memorized over years, the angular jaw and the lines at the corners of his eyes that had deepened slightly with those years, the gray in his dark hair at his temple that had not been there when she had first looked up from Gerald's ledger and found him watching her. "You saw through everything," she said, "every wall. I was so careful and you looked and saw anyway." "You let me," he said. "Eventually," she said. "That's all it takes," he said. "Eventually." She put her head against his shoulder and they sat on the East Ridge shelf with the aspens burning around them and the valley spread below, and the sky going gold and then pink, and then the first deep blue of the autumn evening, and the stars came out one by one with the unhurried abundance of this high clear country, and she was warm beside him and her children were safe below, and her life was real and her own, built by her own hands and his, built honestly from the ground up, and she felt it all the way through. The way the cold mountain air fills the lungs on a sharp morning, the way it reaches into every corner and reminds you that you are entirely and fully present in the world. This was not what she had come west for. It was better than anything she had come west for. It was, she thought, with the precise and genuine satisfaction of a woman who has examined the figures and found them to be true, the best accounting she would ever make. She held his hand in the failing light and did not let go, and there was nothing left to wall off, and nothing she wanted to. The mountains stood around them, indifferent and eternal, and the town below was warm with its small lights, and Redemption Creek kept on being exactly what its name promised, the kind of place where a person could arrive broken and leave whole, where the land itself was honest and the honest people in it were rare and worth the finding, and where a woman with a broken past and a full set of walls could ride in on a spring afternoon and find, against every plan and every reasonable expectation, that she was not done, that she was, in fact, just beginning.